Across the channel and over the last few years, I've reported on some truly weird and unusual disappearances that have taken place all over North America, and some of the following disappearances managed to baffle everyone involved. Now this is a long one, so grab a hot drink and let's begin. On the 29th of January 1942, Patricia Connolly, who was 2.5 years old at the time, vanished from her home in the vicinity of Menlo Park. Google Earth is a little misleading here because in 1942, Menlo Park wasn't as built up as it is today, and I believe Highway 280 didn't exist then. The Connolly family actually lived more rurally, closer to the Los Trancos woods. Some of the neighbours who were unfamiliar to the family were the last to see little Patricia at around 4 PM. She was outside on a patch of grass on the street playing with a stray dog that was often in the neighbourhood. This person said that he stopped his car a moment, asked the child her name and where she lived, and told her that she should go home at once. Then he drove on. She was unable to tell him where she lived. Patricia's father was in hospital at the time as he was ill, and her mother was inside the house right next to where she was playing. Shortly after the neighbour saw Patricia, her mother realised that she'd lost track of her and went outside to retrieve her. Only there was no one to retrieve. The girl and the dog were gone. Now thoroughly in panic mode, she made a search of the neighbourhood. She looked around, walked around the house, called out for Patricia, and then raced to alert the authorities. Investigators came down with canines and began looking around. As it so happened, the dog that Patricia had been playing with was named Lucky, which was sadly not true in this instance. But Lucky turned up again out of nowhere at around 4:30 PM. No one had seen where he'd come from, but two carpenters, Robert and John, who were working nearby before he came back, heard what they said was a peculiar wailing sound. They said that it came from the area near the dam where a creek was located. Now I know what you're thinking, and the authorities were solidified on this position too. After hearing of this, investigators thoroughly believed that she'd fallen into the creek and then swept away. This idea was further substantiated when the searchers' Doberman led them down a trail to the same spot near the creek, sniffed the ground and sat down. This finding was repeated 5 times and the dog led them straight to the creek. If only it was that simple. People flocked to help out, and some Stanford students quickly brought a canoe and some diving gear and started searching the body of water, but they found nothing and were forced out by the cold weather. At this time, temperatures were around freezing, and this search quickly escalated in size and was now becoming an all-nighter. In the meantime, and as the sun began to dip, the weather had worsened and it was now stormy with harsh winds and rain. An all-night search continued today as deputy sheriffs and members of the county fire warden's force grimly dragged the rough, brush-filled creek bottom for the body. In an effort to lower waters in the creek, timbers were placed in the Searsville Lake spillway, raising the lake level 18 inches and temporarily lowering the creek flow. But rains last night and this morning kept the torrent at fairly high levels. Slim hope was held that Patricia might have wandered in another direction and become lost. The timing of the storm was awful, and it was making the creek difficult to search, and saying that hope was hard to come by was correct. Absolutely everyone involved, including the family, believed that she'd fallen in. But day after day, search after search, the creek had nothing to offer. While they patrolled the flooded stream, casting with ropes, tied with hooks, a gangling, floppy, dirty stray pup frolicked about. It was the dog the little girl was last seen playing with. The dog was the only one that knew what happened to Patricia, but some information just cannot be known to us. Now, let's get bizarre. While sheriff's deputies, fire wardens, interested citizens, and the child's parents searched through the night of January 29, and the next day for Patricia, she was actually passing away due to exposure 2.5 miles away. This was theorised by officials today as the result of the finding of the remains yesterday by Henry Haggett while on a cycling and hiking excursion along Portola Road. Just over a hill from deserted picnic tables, and within a few hundred yards of where workmen were building a house at the time, Haggett came across a small pile of bones, wisps of hair and clothing. The article was wrong, and it was actually about 4 miles southwest of the university. This is a rough estimation of where she could have been found. We don't have a precise location, only that it was near Pottola Road and was in a steep ravine. There are other contenders, but this is the rough guesstimate. Now, let's just think about what's happened for a moment. When Patricia went missing initially, 2 carpenters heard the sound of a dog wailing as if it was in distress. This was coming from the creek area, which means it was probably Lucky, the dog she was playing with, that came back to the neighbourhood soaking wet. Both Lucky and various search dogs took investigators to the creek time and time again over a period of days. At the creek, they sat down and the scent ended. Around 3 months later, her body was found somewhere miles away in a ravine over a 650-foot mountain. I cannot imagine for a moment that Patricia was able to get there by herself. In reconstructing the event, investigating officers said the tiny girl must have wandered the hills until she was exhausted and then simply laid down and passed away. Unless in the reconstruction Patricia was given a helicopter, I don't see how that makes sense here. Not if we're saying a 650-foot climb was in the way. Also, a reconstruction of the event was never mentioned anywhere else, so I don't know if that happened or not. I just can't see her walking all the way there. Now, there is a clue that everyone seems to have completely overlooked somehow. This isn't definite of course, and it is speculation, but through the articles, we know that Lucky hated the water, yet he was found soaking wet, as if he himself had definitely been there at the creek. In fact, he had probably been at that creek with Patricia, as confirmed by all of the search dogs. Since that appears to be the case, an argument could be made that someone came across Patricia and the dog by chance, took her, the dog responded and was pushed into the water, and the 2 carpenters unknowingly actually heard the whole thing go down. That is the only rational, yet highly speculative conclusion that I can draw here. Now, to be fair, this disappearance does have the missing 411 written all over it, and I can already hear the comments on this one, that Patricia may have been exposed to something completely out of the ordinary. What I find fascinating about this whole ordeal was that there weren't any articles, or at least that I could find, that were the least bit skeptical about this. There were just no questions asked about it at all. The conclusions that they drew were that the scent leading to the creek must have been a mistake. Lucky was never mentioned again. The place she was found and the effort it would take a 2-year-old to get there wasn't mentioned. It's as if nobody wanted to acknowledge that Patricia might have been taken by someone, even though the idea that she got there alone seems ridiculous. There's an elephant in the room, and everyone was just ignoring it for some reason. Anyway, I've exhausted all of the information I can find on Patricia, so let's turn back the pages to 1924, where I came across another disappearance that I thought was odd, and shares some similarities with Patricia, at least a little. In October of 1924, Margaret Turner was 20 months old and lived with both of her parents in the city of Durango in Colorado. Sometime during the day of the 2nd of October that year, Margaret was inside the home with her mother. I believe the mother was just taking care of things inside the house while her husband was out working, but whatever the case may be, it seems that at some point she lost track of Margaret. The family lived a rural life and their home was isolated away from others. It's not known how Margaret left the home, but during the morning, the mother realised that she was gone. She started to search the house, then it became frantic, and then she was in full-blown panic mode trying to find her. She ran outside and around the home, and then called the La Plata County Sheriff's Office, and they responded quickly. The deputies put a call out for help, and members of the community came to their residence and started to search outside. It became clear to all involved that Margaret just simply wasn't in the area anymore. Some believed that she'd been taken by a third party, while others believed that she must have just walked out and away from the home. Most toddlers begin to start walking around the 11 to 16 month mark, so it's possible I suppose, but I'm not sure how far you'd expect them to be able to get at that age. Now, thankfully, Margaret was found, though not in the way you might expect. Margaret hadn't just been wandering around outside the house, she'd managed to travel over 5 miles west of the point that she disappeared from. Not only that, but she was found on top of a barren peak. This article stated, Evidence indicated that 20-month-old Margaret Turner, found on a mountain after a 24-hour search, had been taken by an enemy of her father, John Turner, and left to pass away. The girl will recover. I'm not sure that there was any physical evidence of this at all. I mean, obviously, aside from the fact that little Margaret had managed to get to the top of a mountain, which would have been impossible alone. But this evidence being referred to in the article, I believe, was more of an accusation made by John about someone who I suppose he didn't get on with. The reason I say that can be found in the next article. The child was unharmed when found, and obviously had not spent the night on a frozen mountaintop where she was found, as to have done so would have meant passing away by freezing. Authorities are searching for the motive of the person who took the child from her home and abandoned her on the mountain after sheltering her for the night. No clue to his identity has yet been found. So in other words, they had no motive and no suspect. It's interesting too, because they all realised that Margaret couldn't have survived being left on the mountain overnight as it was simply too cold, and that she must have been kept warm somehow. So, the hypothesis was that someone, for reasons they couldn't ascertain, came to the home, took Margaret in broad daylight, took her to their home, I suppose, didn't harm her or anything like that, then took her out to the top of a mountain and left her there. The circumstances of this case are prime missing 411 territory. This girl, who couldn't have walked 5 miles away and up a mountain, being found completely unharmed on a mountain, it's just weird. John Turner must have reasoned that his enemy, whoever that was, wanted to get at John by harming his family, so took her to the top of a mountain. That's certainly odd, but not out the realm of possibility. Crazy people do exist after all. But the authorities, it seems, had no evidence of this at all. The sheriff, George Rowe, knew how odd this whole ordeal was, and he said this. Being barely able to walk, however, Sheriff Rowe said it would have been impossible for the baby to have scaled the heights where she was found, or to survive the cold of Thursday night without shelter afforded somewhere else. The spot where the baby was found is in high country, sparsely overgrown with scrub oak. Authorities believe that whoever placed the child on top of the peak did so sometime during the day Friday, as passing away from exposure would have been certain if she laid there all of Thursday night. Margaret was probably kept in a shelter Thursday night, and the person took her to the mountain Friday. So, it seems that everyone was in agreement that Margaret couldn't have made it up there alone. Though no one understood who or why she was taken up there. As said, she'd been completely unharmed and had no injuries at all. This mountain didn't have dense forestry, but rather had small scrub bushes scattered around, which is likely why she was actually found there. It's not clear why some of the searchers ventured this far out, but thank goodness they did. If a person did leave her up there, which seems risky to do in daylight while there's a search ongoing, perhaps he didn't think the search would reach that far so he wouldn't be seen. Some were speculating that a mountain lion may have taken her up there, but it seems like she would have been in far worse condition being dragged around if that were the case. Anyway, again, much like Patricia, I've exhausted all of the information surrounding this case. What do you think happened to her that day? The vast expanse of Canada, with its picturesque landscapes and bustling urban centres, hides a sombre reality. Every year, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police state that somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 individuals are reported missing. While the vast majority of these cases are fortunately resolved quickly, with loved ones being reunited and the unknown being put to bed, there exists a small yet deeply unsettling subset of disappearances that come to defy the norm or have odd qualities to them. The first case I wanted to draw your attention to was the disappearance of a 2-year-old girl called Evelyn Roach, who vanished from her family farm on the 15th of July 1934. This occurred near a town known as Rocky Mountain House in Alberta, which as suggested lies at the base of the Rocky Mountains. It was early that morning, around 9 AM, where Evelyn found herself outside with her father, John, who was spending some playful time with her just after finishing their family breakfast together. They were in the farmyard, but John did need to start work and he had to go tend the cows, which he'd planned to do first, and he didn't think it was going to take too much time that day. Their actual farm home and the barn were only a short distance from where they both stood, and they were practically right in the middle between them. He told Evelyn that he needed to start work and that she needed to go back to the house. He watched her run towards the house and could see that she was close. To be clear, their farm was rural and quite a distance away from the town, with only one road leading to it, so it's not as if you'd be expecting to see anyone around. So as John left and turned his attention to the cows, this left Evelyn alone, almost back at the farmhouse. Now, something happened during this time of separation that isn't at all clear. John spent around an hour that morning tending to the cows, and he was done sooner than he expected. As John was finishing up, he hurried back to the farmhouse, anticipating Evelyn's cheerful smile and laughter as he would usually be met with. But on this occasion, he wouldn't have it. Instead, he was met with an eerie silence, followed by a panic when his wife realised that Evelyn and John weren't together. It's not difficult to imagine, but they both began to freak out. John ran outside and started to call for her quite frantically, but it didn't matter in which direction he looked. It was just an empty farm. John searched for her in desperation, but for whatever reason, he just could not locate her at all. She wasn't responding to his shouts. It was as if she'd somehow gotten very far away suspiciously quickly. John and the family had been searching for a couple of hours at this point in his panic before they realised they needed help. This was around noon when the gravity of the situation became clear to John, and this sanctuary that was the family farm that they'd known and loved now must have seemed quite endless and threatening. The authorities and the surrounding community were made aware of what had happened, and an all-out search was launched. Thankfully, it seems that John and his family were well liked, and they had over 150 boots on his property the same day as law enforcement got the word out. All things considered, barring the family's initial search, this was a quick response. I get the sense that these locals all knew one another and were closely knit based on the articles, and it was said that they were all filled with the determination and hope to bring her back. Together, being led by professional search and rescue coordinators, they searched every nook and cranny of that farm. The barn was the initial focus, thinking that perhaps she'd gone back to John. They combed through the tall corn stalks, but she wasn't there. The entire perimeter of that farm was searched and researched, but they just couldn't find her. When that failed, there was an air of confusion, as it seemed that most didn't believe that she could have left the farm. But because the search had failed, it forced them to spread out to the surrounding areas. As the sun began to set and darkness began to fall on the farm, I can only imagine the anguish that John and the family must have been feeling. That particular moment must have been a truly horrible and hopeless feeling that I can only hope that everyone watching this never has to suffer. The search did continue overnight, but at a reduced scale because now the dangers of the wilderness areas became highlighted. And the worst thing to have happen would be for someone else to go missing, or to have them get injured and need rescue. That would have caused chaos, and the whole area would have to have been searched from scratch again. Teams would have been split up further, it would have just been a mess. So during the night, they only had professional searchers out looking for her, but of course, the likelihood of finding her in the dark dropped drastically. The following morning came with an air of urgency as it had been very cold overnight. Word of Evelyn's disappearance had spread like wildfire amongst the community, and as the sun began to rise, the number of searchers had surged to over 300 people. This was very good for a number of reasons. It was getting to the point that the organisers weren't sure exactly where to search next, as they didn't even have a direction of travel to work with. The dogs never found a scent anywhere on the farm or leading past the home, and she hadn't left any signs of her travel either, in the sense that no footprints or other tracks were ever found. So now, with that many people, they were able to use a brute force approach and just had teams of people all over the place looking for her. Various teams waded through the river, others grassland and forest areas, and some were out checking barns, sheds and other undergrowth. Close to noon that day, a man by the name of Joe Bertagnolli had been searching all morning, and he was there early. He was searching the wetlands, now covered in mud, hot and sweating, where he heard a faint cry which was over 1.5 miles away from the farm. Standing in tall grass beside a slough, she was crying bitterly when she was found by Joe, a farmer who was one of the search party. She was hurried home, found to be suffering from no ill effects except exhaustion and was put to bed. She was unable to explain where she had been and how she had lived through 2 hot days and 2 cold nights without food since she vanished early Sunday. Unfortunately, Evelyn was not able to articulate exactly what had happened, and it was said that she didn't actually remember what happened to her. She was probably highly disoriented, confused, and might even have blocked it out of her mind, which can happen where trauma is related. Her young age also will have made it a problem to try to explain it. John and the family didn't really understand what had happened. He stopped to watch her run back to the house, and he believed that she was about to go inside, which she always did. I suppose he quite literally must have turned his back before she got inside. But I wonder what happened in those few moments. Did something catch her attention and she just took off after it? One big worry was that she'd been snatched by an animal, but that was swiftly ruled out after she was found. The searchers did wonder how she'd managed to stay warm overnight. Specific temperatures weren't given, other than the suggestion that it was dangerous, especially for someone so young who wasn't dressed appropriately for it. It's actually a fairly good point too. Obviously, these oddities and these disappearances are kind of just put aside after the missing has been found, because there's just a sense of elation that it's over and there's been a good ending. But I wonder what she did to keep warm. How exactly did she go missing in the first place so close to the home? And what did her time missing actually look like? I'd imagine her parents had a million questions for her too, but unfortunately there was never anything else said about it. That was the end of the paper trail also, so at least it had the best ending it could have, despite the fact that the parents didn't really understand the hows and whys of the situation. Now, let's explore the next one, which also took place in Alberta. In the heart of Alberta stretches a vast expanse of protected wilderness named Elk Island National Park. On a seemingly ordinary 29th of June in 1979, the Rima family decided once more to partake in an activity that they absolutely loved doing together, which was exploring and hiking what are supposed to be their relatively safe national parks. This was a family that loved spending time together hiking, and it seems that this is a passion they wanted to pass down to Kevin, who also seemed to have a natural love for these wilderness areas. Velma and Peter, Kevin's parents, alongside his 2 older brothers and sister, found a spot that they liked the look of and decided to pitch their tent in the north end of the park. But as dawn turned to mid-morning on the same day, they were abruptly forced into a mad panic as they came to the realization that Kevin was simply not present anymore. A search for a 9-year-old boy missing in Elk Island National Park continued today, with Canadian Armed Forces teams preparing to help. No clues have been found to the whereabouts of Kevin Rima of Edmonton. It's so frustrating because we have absolutely nothing to go on. Virtually all trails have already been covered by dogs. The lake is not conducive to dragging because of high grass, but divers have searched the area, said RCMP Constable John Oman. This is very interesting, and you'll notice that John directly referenced the dogs being unable to find a scent anywhere. He knew full well that this was a highly unusual factor in the disappearance because Kevin had literally vanished right beneath his parents' noses at the campsite. To further clarify that point, Velma and Peter did not see anyone else around them at the time, nor did they hear anything out of the ordinary. It's not clear exactly when it happened, but Kevin was around while they were putting the tent together, but at some point at noon, around the time the parents were cooking, he managed to vanish so thoroughly that the dogs could not find a scent anywhere. Which common sense indicates doesn't make sense. It does not add up that a small boy could disappear in this place and not leave a scent trail in the direction he took. The dogs were brought to the campsite and they just sat down. They didn't have anything to follow, which is particularly odd. Just based off the articles, it seems that a lot of hope was placed on the dogs to explain exactly where he went. The RCMP also go on to state in the article that they found small footprints in the area. I believe it was initially felt that these were left behind by Kevin, but when the dogs couldn't locate a scent in the area, they deemed them as irrelevant to the case. To clarify, the small footprints were alone, about the right size for Kevin, but they quickly petered out and couldn't be followed, even by the expert trackers that were among the 100 initial searches. Just as a further point actually, some might find it interesting that armed forces were involved, but this was probably for extra numbers and also to preserve the safety of the searchers. I'd imagine that there is quite a lot of potentially dangerous wildlife in the area, and especially as they branched out deeper into the wilderness. But Canadians will know better than I do here, so please do let me know in the comments if bears among other predators are common there. Anyway, you'll note that Kevin disappeared 4 days before that article was written. So this search had been ongoing for a while now, and nothing was turning up outside of the first set of footprints. It actually seems that the search leaders were left a bit clueless as to how to proceed, and that isn't a dig at them, there were no leads at all. It was very difficult for them to know where they were even actually supposed to search at that stage. So with that desperation in mind, they requested assistance from the Fort Saskatchewan jail, and 100 low-risk prisoners volunteered themselves to join the search. Think of that what you will, but it is understandable if they just wanted to flood the area with even more people for that brute force approach, which, if you have no leads at all, is really your only option. John Oman said that to see such unexpected help was a major boost to morale. He also pointed out that a significant number of these individuals were of Metis and Native American ancestry and knew the land like the back of their hands. That was actually quite an interesting decision to have made. It shows an air of desperation from the RCMP, and I'd imagine the hope that some of these people had some rather great tracking skills which were severely in need. However, that hope quickly drained when the combined efforts of over 350 people that day led to no significant leads or even a sign of Kevin, leading John to say, if he isn't found within the next day, it's unlikely he'll survive. More than 350 volunteers, plus an assortment of clairvoyants, failed to turn up any clues Wednesday. We don't plan to give up until there is absolutely no hope. I always find it particularly interesting when the authorities get clairvoyants involved. I personally have always thought that it was a waste of time and a source of false hope, but I have covered a number of disappearances in the past in which someone who dreamed of the missing ended up finding them. It's really quite a bizarre thing, so maybe there's more to it, who knows. Velma and Peter expressed their sheer incredulity at 2 things. Firstly, the fact that they couldn't even come to terms with how Kevin even managed to leave in the first place, and 2, the sheer scale of the search that was repeatedly, day after day, ending in failure. They essentially made the point that Kevin did not have a habit of wandering away from them and would usually stay close to them. I'm paraphrasing, but they also said that for this search to be spectacularly failing in the way that it was must have meant that Kevin had managed to move a seemingly impossible distance away from the camp, or it means that he was taken. The obvious problem with the first suggestion was that he was 9 years old and really should not have been able to outpace the many hundreds of adults now scouring the area for him. While possible of course and should never be ruled out, the idea of him being taken runs into trouble because the family had said that there was no one around their camp. More specifically, it seems that something happened as the parents were cooking. They'd taken their eyes off Kevin as they were prepping together, and in those moments when they were distracted, whatever that something was now meant that he was completely out of the area. It's interesting to think about because the dogs had been up and down the area along all trails and they hadn't found Kevin's scent at any point, which suggests to me quite strongly that he simply wasn't even there anymore. Now where he went and how he left is another story entirely which isn't known. The professionals among the searchers were quite certain that it wasn't animal predation, as that usually becomes quite clear early on, and the likelihood is that the dogs would have picked up on that. As mentioned, the family said that there was nobody around them, so what happened? I should also point out that his brothers and sister also didn't hear or notice him leave. This next part is somewhat bizarre, but on the 8th day of the search, I'm sure that you can imagine the constable and the professional searchers now believed that they were looking for a body. The parents, on the other hand, were essentially stating that they didn't know why, but they felt he was still alive. Velma went on to say something particularly unusual. Mrs. Reamer said she dreamed 4 times on Friday of a cave ringed with a halo, but was told by wardens there were no caves in the area. I have no real comments to make about that, other than it was just something interesting that was reported. Now, let's hear some specifics of the search itself. The RCMP called off the search for Kevin. Police said every conceivable area had been covered, some repeatedly by helicopter, fixed-wing aircraft, boats, scuba divers, dragging operations, tracking dogs, men on horseback and on foot. Infrared scanners from helicopters and clairvoyants were also used in the search. An effort that involved 15,000 man-hours by civilian volunteers, RCMP officers, prisoners and 144 soldiers. The RCMP constable coordinating the search said that the disappearance appeared to be more than just a little boy lost in the woods. "We have covered far beyond where the boy could have got to," said Constable John Oman. "I've never been in a search that has been this intensive. The foot search was the last resort, and now that has failed." So, with the statement that the incident was more than that of just a little boy lost in the woods, it seems that John, by this time, was fully aware of how out of the ordinary this entire incident was. I find it quite fascinating, to be honest, that the tracking dogs never found his scent once. That's not typical. I am also now finding out for the first time that at some point on the day that Kevin vanished, a woman had seen a small boy who asked for directions back to his family's campsite. I'm not sure what was going on there. The later papers seem to be suggesting that this was definitely Kevin, but I'm not sure if that was ever actually completely proven. Although whether it was or wasn't him, if a 9-year-old boy appears to be lost and asking for directions, I might suggest as an adult to actually physically take the boy back. It's unbelievable that this entire incident could have been avoided if that actually was Kevin, of course. So this whole time I've been operating under the idea that Kevin could not have been physically taken by another person from the campsite, as that would have been heard and likely seen by the family. But if we're saying that under the nose of his brothers, sister and parents, he had first walked away far enough to come into contact with other people, well, that changes the equation entirely. If it was in fact Kevin that came into contact with the woman and asked for directions, he very well could have come into contact with other people who were less well-intentioned. It is interesting that the dogs never found his scent, which actually makes it seem even more likely now that he had been completely extracted from the park. There's no evidence of that, of course, but the probability of that seems to be quite high at this stage. Even still though, you might have expected the dogs to have found the area in which Kevin had walked to first. A professional tracker by the name of Tom Brown Jr. seems to have come to a similar conclusion. To date, the only clues discovered arise from Tom Brown Jr.'s claim that he found Kevin's footprints and a tuft of hair, and that he could chart the child's movements at the park from noon to 4:30 PM the day he went missing. Known as the Tracker, Mr. Brown claims he has located more than 600 of the 1,000 missing persons he has sought. The Tracker's conclusion: Kevin was taken from the park. That is basically the end of the paper trail for Kevin. He was never found inside or outside of the park. He was a young boy that quite literally just dropped off the radar and was never seen again. I'd like to hear some thoughts in regards to this disappearance. Do you think he was taken by someone, or do you think something else happened? The Sequoia National Park, located in California, attracts over 1 million visitors every year and is home to ancient and some of the largest trees in the world. This area is vast, and 97% of the park's land is considered wilderness, so it's no surprise that people have vanished in this place. However, there are some disappearances that managed to baffle searchers who couldn't make sense of the circumstances. Let's begin by discussing the first disappearance that interested me almost immediately after reading it for reasons you'll come to see in a moment. This happened to Andrew Thackerson, who was 5 years old at the time, on the 17th of August 1953. On that day, his parents had decided to visit the park with their 3 boys, 9, 7, and obviously the focus of this report, Andrew. In the very first report, there was little information, only that Andrew had disappeared next to the General Sherman tree. For those that don't know, this tree is ancient, having now reached 2,200 years, and is the largest tree in the world as measured by volume. It stands at 275 feet tall and 36 feet in diameter. As they were standing next to this tree in awe at the sight, Andrew managed to vanish right under the noses of his parents, and they had absolutely no idea how or what had happened. They were alone at the time, with no one else nearby, and they hadn't heard Andrew shout or anything of that nature. The parents, growing nervous, began to call for Andrew, and the father scouted deep into the trees to retrieve his son, but there was nothing but a deafening silence. Panicking now, the family rushed to report this incident to the authorities, and action was taken swiftly. A search team was put together that reached the size of 150 men within 24 hours. And together, they began to sweep the area using a grid search method. Various bloodhound teams were scattered around this area, and despite the parents providing Andrew's clothing to them, the dogs weren't able to find a scent, and as far as I can tell, they were in the forest areas overnight. Now, despite that, I do just want to say that this incident thankfully did have a happy ending. However, Andrew managed to confuse everyone involved. Searchers today found Andrew sleeping peacefully, unharmed and well on a mountain trail in Sequoia National Park, where he had been missing since yesterday morning. Temporary Ranger Carl Kronberg headed the search party of 20 persons who came across Andrew in the Panther Meadow region. He was 3 miles from the spot where he wandered away from his parents. Kronberg found Andrew lying face down on the trail, sleeping. He was checked at a hospital and found to be in good shape, despite spending a night in the forest where temperatures may drop to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Some outlets reported that this distance that he was found was actually 6 miles, and there seems to be an even number reporting the two figures, so it's not completely clear which is the case. However, that distance wasn't the most surprising fact. Despite Andrew being found within 24 hours, this was a difficult search to undertake because the area was still mountainous. It was said to be very rugged and had steep areas all over the place. Despite that, Carl estimated that Andrew had been walking aimlessly for around 12 miles, and other searchers estimated an even higher figure than that, with some saying up to 18 miles. That is staggering and simply unbelievable to think that a 5-year-old could walk that far in an area like this in 24 hours. That doesn't make sense to me, nor did it make sense to some of the searchers, and it seems to me that most adults are going to struggle with a feat like this, especially when you consider the terrain. There were searchers involved that knew that this was odd and felt that there must have been more information to know. But because Andrew was found, there wasn't much discussion on it in the press, past the surprise and confusion shown by the searchers. Though I'm sure between themselves they discussed all kinds of scenarios. But it just seems that when a person is found, that's the end of it, and no further conversations take place. Andrew never gave a statement to the press, which was probably a good decision for the parents to have made, because you don't want him to dwell on the experience, because these kinds of events can cause a lot of trauma if you're not careful, especially for someone so young. I'm sure his parents did have a lot of questions for him though. I'm also not even sure how much of this he'd actually remember, given that he was out of it and dazed upon being found. There was probably a lot of shock going on there. These discussions may have been important though, because the distance travelled in the end could indicate that he wasn't alone. Though despite the surprising distance, there wasn't anything else in the way of evidence to support either being moved by another person or an animal. And also, if it was an animal, you probably wouldn't have expected him to have been found, at least safe. Thankfully, Andrew was found and in good condition, but it certainly seems that some of the searchers wanted to know more about this and what had happened. What are your thoughts here? Now, let's head to Yosemite. David Paul Morrison, 28, was a San Francisco chef when he disappeared in the park towards the end of May in 1998. On that day, the 25th, David, a seasoned hiker, ventured into Yosemite with his girlfriend as he wanted to show her the towering vistas. As a part of this trip, the plan was also aimed at conquering the Half Dome's challenging trails, which he'd been excited to embark on for a while now. The morning of his disappearance was like any other in the vast expanse of the park. The sun cast its early rays, the wildlife stirred, and the scent of pine was in the air. The night prior, David had told his girlfriend that he was going to get up nice and early to go for a solo hike in the park before meeting back up with her. David was up and out at 5:30 that morning and would be spotted at 7:15 in Little Yosemite Valley, a waypoint for those en route to Half Dome. That was the only time that David was seen that morning, and after his hike in the valley, he would never be seen or heard from again. The people that saw him that morning would later relay that he didn't appear to be equipped for overnight camping. They said that he was only wearing a sweatshirt and running shoes, but did have a day pack. Despite this, David was overwhelmingly unprepared to spend hours and hours out in the wilderness, especially when heading into the coldness of the night. Despite David's experience in the outdoors, the conditions that day changed quickly and not in his favour. As he embarked on his journey, the weather took an immediate turn. Cloud cover was low and visibility was less than ideal. As time went on, his girlfriend went to their arranged meeting point, which wasn't far from the place that they were staying, and she waited there patiently. After a couple of hours went by, she became concerned, which prompted a missing persons report soon thereafter. The search that ensued was immediate and would become fairly extensive. On the first night, there were people out looking for David with the assumption that he might be stuck and hurt somewhere. Given that his plans were known to his girlfriend, the organisers did expect to find him relatively quickly somewhere around Half Dome. This initial search failed to locate David, so when the morning came, they tried again in larger numbers. This also resulted in failure though. 2 days after he vanished, the search team was composed of 75 experienced searchers assisted by 5 dog teams and helicopters. When the organisers' expectations of finding him quickly didn't come to fruition, it seems that there was a panic and a scramble to get a hold of as many dog teams as they could. Search dog teams, generally speaking, have a very high success rate. In this paper, researchers were trying to gauge search dog effectiveness. They found that there was a success base rate of 76.4% at locating the objective, or, I suppose, somewhere around 4 out of 5 times you'd expect success. But in this instance, there was no success to be found. Not only had the repeated ground searches failed, the dogs could not find his scent anywhere in the Half Dome or Little Yosemite Valley areas. There was an extra oddity to this. In the search report, there was a statement left by a Tom Roseman, who in the operational section stated this: "We had problems with our GPS units on this operation. One GPS, when turned on, stated that all stored data was lost, and both took a significant amount of time to auto-locate, 10 minutes or more." What was interesting about this, I suppose, was that Tom nor the searchers really understood why. The GPS devices were fully functional, but were having some technical problems in this specific area on that specific day. There's not a great amount of elaborating I could do, as that was all that was said about it. On the 3rd day that David was missing, the Fresno Bee reported this: "As ominous storm clouds move in, air and ground searchers will try again today to find a San Francisco man missing in Yosemite National Park. David has been lost in Yosemite's high country for 3 nights in freezing temperatures," park spokesman Kendall Thompson said. At least 5 inches of new snow fell in Little Yosemite Valley Monday night, and intermittent rain fell Tuesday. On the 5th day of David being missing, it was stated that searchers had found half a dozen tracks that they believed might have been left by David as it matched his boot type. I believe these prints were found in a relatively remote area. So once again, they brought the dogs to the footprints, but they could still not follow them anywhere, and the footprints petered out into nothing. Then, soon after this, the entire area was blanketed by snow again, and hopes were now fading, as it would have meant that David by this point had spent 4 nights in the freezing cold. Around a week into the search, the organisers were completely out of ideas. The area had already been flooded with 250 people out looking, and now as a last-ditch effort, they wanted to do the same with dogs. I've never heard of so many dog teams on a search before, but on this one, they now had 15 dog teams out there scouring the area for him. These dogs, which supposedly have a 76% find rate, were all failing. I don't believe his scent was found even a single time, which is odd. Here's another interesting point that was made by the Fresno Bee around a month after David vanished. As days passed during the search, the frustration mounted. People wondered how a hiker with some experience such as David could have been lost on such a well-known trail. So, for reasons unknown, David had completely left the trail and was now somewhere that nobody could find him. Why this was the case, nobody really knew. No trace of him or his belongings have ever surfaced in the years since the day of his disappearance. All we're left with is a peculiar set of circumstances and a range of unanswered questions. What happened to David Paul Morrison and where did he go? Now, at this point, I wanted to turn our attention to Dikran Nagian, a 29-year-old medical student born in Ethiopia but raised in the UK. He was an intelligent man who was studying at Cambridge University in England. Dikran disappeared on the 24th of July 1972 while on a vacation at the national park. He had rented a cabin on that day in Curry Village, and that was quite literally the very last time anyone had ever seen him. We can make a fairly strong assumption that he vanished on the day that he arrived because he was due to check out on the 31st of July, just 1 week after his arrival. When that day came, employees who came to sort out the cabin for the next visitors realised that all of Dikran's belongings were still in there, untouched. In addition to this, the employees also realised that the bed hadn't been slept in at all. The only clues left behind were that 1, he'd asked the reception for directions to Half Dome, and 2, he'd taken his camera with him. Unfortunately, the biggest issue immediately was the fact that Dikran had been missing unnoticed for an entire week already. In the Modesto Bee paper, around a month after he vanished, Chief Ranger Jack Moorhead stated, "We've checked everything, every ride, every concessionaire, all the hiking trails, all the backcountry areas, and we can't locate a trace of him." Interestingly, it seems that Dikran may have disappeared in fairly close proximity to David since they both appear to have been near the Half Dome area. There wasn't a lot of reporting done outside of this, and we didn't learn of the specifics of the search. What we do know is that all efforts to locate Dikran or his remains failed, and all trails near Half Dome had been searched. The point was made that the trails are clear and obvious, and deviating from them, generally, is not usually something that happens accidentally. Like David though, if Dikran had strayed away from the trail, it's not at all clear why he did this. Now Dikran's father, Vartkus, was the owner of one of the oldest diamond companies in the world, so Vartkus was able to employ a private investigator who travelled to Yosemite to conduct his own investigation after the official search came to a close. This private investigator spoke with employees at Curry Village along with the park rangers and tried as best he could to retrace Dikran's possible route. Unfortunately though, like the official search, he wasn't able to uncover anything at all. This is one of those rarer instances in which law enforcement really had no insight at all as to what happened to him. The only assumption was that he must have suffered from exposure or an injury that caused his passing. It seems that the expectation was that his remains would be found over time as people came to explore and hike around the park. That didn't happen though. In fact, over 50 years later now, Dikran has never been found. His family did try to gather more information from the park service itself, even writing to the governor at the time, but their requests were all denied, which is a little odd. I'm not really sure why the park service would prevent the family from having access to information surrounding the search or the disappearance itself. That doesn't really make any sense to me. Anyway, given that the park service didn't seem to want to share anything about this with the family for some reason, that basically brings us to the end of the paper trail. So, let's instead move to the summer of 2007, where Yosemite National Park became the backdrop for another baffling disappearance. Otterina Bonventura, otherwise known as Trina, 80 years old, set out to conquer the trails of Vogelsang High Sierra Camp. She was completely unaware that this would be the last time she'd ever be seen. While Trina couldn't get around like she could in her younger years, her retirement was anything but sedentary. Each morning she would work out and was out hiking with her friends a lot. She was very fit for her age. Now, some of the trails in the area are known to be somewhat difficult, but they are said to be clear to follow. Surrounding the camp is a rugged expanse where granite giants thrust skywards and crystal clear lakes reflect the vastness of the wilderness. The camp itself is accessible only by foot or horseback and is a series of quaint cabins. On the 30th of July 2007, she was with 3 of her friends and they were staying together at the campsite. Early that morning, they had made the decision to hike along one of the well-known trails in the area, and they enjoyed the wilderness setting for a few hours. After they'd hiked for a time, it seems that Trina had enough and was about ready to head back to camp. It also seems that she was concerned about their food storage because of black bears in the area, so off she went and headed back alone. That decision marked the beginning of a puzzle. Sometime later, the rest of the group had also decided that they'd had enough and were ready to go back to camp. They had no idea that anything was wrong, but upon returning, they couldn't locate Trina anywhere. They called out for her around the campsite, but there was no response. They walked around the entire perimeter of the camp without any success before retracing their steps along the trail. She wasn't there. To make matters even more confusing, the group could not figure out why she would have left the trail. As said, apparently it seems that the trail itself was quite clear to follow. It is important to note that Trina, on occasion, was known to suffer from memory loss, though the papers didn't state the severity of these episodes. On the day after she disappeared, 150 search and rescue personnel, including highly trained specialists for high altitude recovery, arrived, but they could find no trace of Trina. The search dog teams, which as mentioned before are usually reliable, but they were confounded, with their noses leading them in circles, finding nothing. Adrienne Freeman, who was a part of the National Park Service's Incident Investigations Unit, stated, "We've picked up a few clues here and there that we are investigating." Frustratingly though, she didn't elaborate on that, and it's not clear what clues she was referring to because all the articles seem to suggest that there wasn't a hint of her anywhere. As the days ticked by, the search expanded in scope, but contracted in terms of a hopeful conclusion. During the search, thunderclouds amassed overhead, and a torrent of rain and harsh winds were unleashed that battered the searchers. Lightning forked the sky, and rain lashed the landscape, washing away any potential clues. Though, despite what Adrienne said, I don't believe they'd found anything tangible. Despite the weather worsening, the search persisted, with teams combing through the dense underbrush and scaling rocky outcrops. Searchers made the point that with knowing the trail that she'd been on, it was odd that all attempts were failing. The searching continued for weeks, and the question of Trina's fate remained unanswered until the 14th of August, 2 weeks after she vanished. A park ranger, during a routine patrol 3 miles from the established paths, stumbled upon a scene that brought the exhaustive search to an end. Trina's body was found in the Echo Creek drainage, which is described as rugged wilderness southwest of Tulum Meadows. The ranger found her there at 5 p.m. in a vegetated area beside a dry creek bed. The Fresno Bee paper stated that this was an area that was unreachable by the established trails and was actually rather difficult to get to. They also stated something quite interesting, so let's get bizarre. I quote, "The cause of Trina's passing is under investigation. Searchers had passed through the area in the past 2 weeks but found no trace of the missing woman," Adrienne said. More than 150 searchers participated in the search. Dog teams and helicopters were used as well. So the exact area Trina was found had been gone over multiple times beforehand, meaning that somehow she'd managed to avoid the searchers in the area. It also appears that a cause wasn't established either. NWITtimes.com stated that rangers do not suspect foul play, and they did not find any clear evidence of how she passed away. It's both odd and interesting that in some of these disappearances, the missing is discovered in an area that had already been searched multiple times beforehand. It suggests that the searchers may have been near her at some point, as she must have been around that general area, but somehow, for some reason, she'd managed to evade them completely and can't have heard any of the calls for her. Now at this point, let's travel back to Sequoia National Park for the final disappearance. There is unfortunately a frustrating lack of information and understanding of this next disappearance, but it is most certainly deserving of being brought up again. Philip Ahrens, who was 42 years old at the time, was reported missing by his brother on the 7th of September 2005 in the park. The pair of them were on a multi-day hiking trip which began at Mineral King, and it was supposed to end there too after completing a loop. Now, during this hike, Philip began to feel unwell, and the pair hiked and came out at a different trailhead. At this point, Philip's brother told him to stay put right there while he hitchhiked a ride back to where the car was parked so he could swing back around, pick up Philip, and then drive them both home. Philip agreed and got comfortable with his backpack, which had supplies including water, and this round trip for the brother would unfortunately take around 5 hours in total to make it back to Philip's location. When the brother finally got back, he realised that Philip just wasn't around anymore, and he began to poke into the forest calling for him, but not once did he ever receive a reply. As far as I can tell also, there wasn't anyone else present, just the pair of them before Philip was alone for 5 hours. Initial searches near Crescent Meadow, the area in which Philip was last seen by his brother, were narrowed down to a point off the Sugar Pine Trail after search teams located the missing man's sunglasses, said Alexandra Picavet of the National Park Service. The area has heavy vegetation and steep embankments, making search conditions difficult, she said. More than 40 ground searchers, mounted patrol, a dog team, employees and volunteers combed the area for days along with the aid of a helicopter crew. Philip's body was found late Saturday at the bottom of a steep embankment near Crescent Creek, less than a mile from the Crescent Meadow parking area. Officials believe he may have passed away due to exposure. The article then went on to explain that officials had absolutely no idea why Philip left the area. While the cause of passing wasn't completely clear, and an official conclusion was never published by the press, it is likely that it was down to exposure, given that his body was found 3 days after the date of disappearance, and, I assume, had seemingly sustained no injuries, or that would have been mentioned, and the cause a little more obvious if a fall or something like that had taken place. Now, what is odd about this is why Philip felt the need to move in the first place. You have a situation in which Philip was sat comfortably waiting for his brother. He had supplies, shade, water, and he felt unwell, so it's hard to imagine that all of a sudden he wanted to go on some long solo hike. Yet still, for some unknown reason that the authorities could never determine, he decided it best to move out from this spot into the rugged, hazardous and steep surrounding areas away from the trail. Why? There was no other press reports that I could find about this, but it certainly seems like a piece of information is missing here. Given that they found his sunglasses, it also seems like he began to abandon items, or perhaps was moving a little too quickly and dropped them. That also seems like it warrants a conversation. Could he have been afraid? He dropped them and didn't bother retrieving them, which means that in that moment it just wasn't important. Was there another presence nearby that essentially made him feel uncomfortable, and perhaps not so physically pushed him away from the car park and into a more remote area to get away? This is interesting because it's unlikely to have been an animal in this instance, because there would have been clear evidence upon finding the body if that were the case. Instead, we have a situation where this man was found, I'm assuming uninjured given the description by authorities to the press. I have no doubt, as is the suggestion, that after a while he became lost and then later expired due to exposure. But that does not seem like the whole story. He got up and moved for a reason that was never determined. Again, it seems to me that there's a missing piece of information here, and something that we don't know occurred in between the brother hitchhiking and driving back to his brother. His family described him as an avid backpacker and climber and loved ice climbing. He also liked canoeing, fishing and backpacking with his dog. So this was a man that was comfortable and experienced in the outdoors, given he'd been doing his favourite activities for so long. That, sadly, is the end of the paper trail, and there was barely any reporting on Philip, leaving us with another example of someone inexplicably, and for seemingly no apparent reason, leaving and disappearing into the forest. What happened here? It's time to end this video. If you made it this far, then I hope you found this compilation interesting. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell, and subscribe if you haven't already. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.